Welcome to the WowFactor Podcast. And today we have a very special guest who has a very expanded background in executive coaching. He's an executive coach, a facilitator, keynote speaker with over 30 years experience of leadership coaching, mentoring, and emotional intelligence. So without further hesitation, I would like to introduce you to the founder of Veritas Leadership Group, Trent. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Sam, for having me. I appreciate it. Looking forward to our time together.
Awesome. So how has been your week so far?
Excellent. We adopted a beagle, so we have a new puppy in the house, and that's disrupted our normal routine. But I would say change is good, and we're enjoying the little guy. He's only 2 months old.
Wow, that's a lot of activity going on there.
It's a lot. Our kids are mostly adults at this point. Our youngest is 17. And so they're doing some of the night shift, which is helpful. So I'm getting some beauty sleep still. It's good.
Nice. Quite interesting. So what drove you to get the beagle?
Well, we rescued a beagle about 9 years ago, and his name is Lincoln, and we've loved him. He's getting older in years, and we thought it would be nice for him to have a companion, somebody to kind of keep him a little younger and running around and active. So that's where we decided to rescue another one. Here in the States, there's a bit of a challenge with owners that don't want their dogs anymore after hunting season. And this mom had puppies, and we were able to rescue one of the puppies. So give him a loving home and, see if we can't turn things around for him.
That's amazing. So as we kick this off, people would like to know, who is Trent?
Trent Booth, born and raised in Canada. My wife and I are actually both from Canada. We moved here to the States about 20 years ago. I started off in a selling organization called Vector Marketing. They sell Cutco cutlery, which is probably the largest manufacturer and retailer of high quality cutlery in America. And really had a unique opportunity to work with them young and start studying leadership right at 19 years old. So they also promote from within. So by the time I was 21, they let me run a city like Montreal, which is about 3 million people. It's a large city. And so there it was, right out of college, running a pretty major metropolitan city in North America here. And just learning how to lead and how to serve and how to read people and troubleshoot and listen to what they're saying, but then also try to discern what they mean. So not just what they're saying, but what's underneath that. And started my journey then. And about 20 years ago, my wife and I moved down here to the States. We're just outside Philadelphia in New Jersey. And I discovered coaching about, I'm going to say 2007. So what's that, 17 years now. And I didn't even know what that term meant. So if you'd said to high school Trent Booth, 18, what do you want to be when you grow up? Coaching wasn't in the vernacular in the early 90s. That wasn't a thing that I even knew was a position or a possibility. So when I went through my first coaching experience, it was, I'd been leading large teams and I had probably 6 or 7 direct reports to me, but dozens or even hundreds of sales reps underneath them. But nobody was pouring into me in particular. I had a manager that I enjoyed connecting with, but we had a lot of other conversations we had to have, including key performance indicators, how are you doing with the numbers, et cetera. When I was coached for the first time, this was like 45 minutes of somebody else pouring into me, and that made it so I was able to pour into others much better. So when I discovered that, I started to pursue how I could become a coach myself, and it turns out I was pretty good. Some of the people I was coaching at Vector became outliers in their industry and set records. And to the company's credit, they promoted me and created a whole new division called the Training and Leadership Department, Training and Leadership Development Department. Invested over $1 million in the next several years into developing their leaders and helping them grow. So a big part of that coaching was mostly raising awareness, asking good questions. And in our experience, the people usually know, Samuel, the things they ought to do. And if we hold space and time for them to ask a few questions, they can identify where they're strong, where they're great, double down on those strengths. If there's something that's keeping them up at night or causing pain, they can identify answers for that. And as they start to move forward and unscale up, their businesses tend to grow. So it's been a wild ride for these past 17 years, but 30 overall in terms of how we got our start.
Well, what has mainly struck me is the age of 21 leading such a very huge team. So
Very
how was
unique.
the mindset shift at that time?
I remember flying into that city, and it's a huge city. So flying over it, I was like, I can't believe they let me run this. And I've got a daughter that's now 22. That's a big responsibility for her. And I have a son that's 20 years old thinking, hey, a year from now, I have moved across the country. Like, we're talking 3,000 kilometers away from home. It's far. So it was exhilarating. It was exciting. It was mine. So here's a fun story for you. I was working, and I didn't even think about how often and how long the hours were, because it was my thing. I was kind of a solopreneur, and I had no help, no assistance. So I would get into the office about 7:30, and I would leave at like 10 at night every day, except for maybe Sundays. I was probably going in from 12 till 6. I took a census. Canada was taking a census that first year in 1995. And one of the questions was, how many hours did you work last week? And I added it up, and I was with a new friend that I'd met, and she said, you worked 83 and a half hours last week. That's more than 2 full-time jobs. And that was the first time it dawned on me that I was putting that much time, because it was mine, because it was a thing that I was building. It didn't feel like 83 and a half hours of work. It was something I was just excited to build. That ownership made all the difference, I think, Samuel.
Wow, that's quite a lot to digest. If 80 hours is that's 2 full-time jobs.
It's not sustainable long term, right? Better keep that to 100 days or less. But I was 21, so I guess I had the energy, and it's one of those things where if you've got that type of energy and time, maybe you should, and see what kind of experience you can glean in the interim.
True. So as we just dial in, as you talked about leading, so what are your thoughts on leadership? Are leaders made, or are they born?
It's a great question. I do think that anyone can lead. I think that they're trained. I think it can be learned. That said, I do believe that certain people have certain qualities that would be in their nature that would perhaps predispose them to looking like a leader. So, in this question, in my mind, it's always like there's somebody probably leading first, identifying you as a leader. So they're seeing something in you. And I had teachers even in elementary school, or coaches, that would identify something in me that they would say, that kid's a leader, or he's got some skills that we could develop. And so I had what I would call a sponsor, somebody saying, I believe in you. I think you can do well. And having found that unique opportunity at Vector Marketing, it gave me a chance to dive in, even at a young age, with somebody that wasn't going to hold me back based on that age or that lack of experience. So I was given great books to read early. I was encouraged to journal and think. I was encouraged to capture my own philosophy in terms of how the world works and journal that out and get refined with that. I was encouraged to constantly level up and lead. And I think when you take the raw materials that I was bringing to the table, combined with that work ethic and that invitation to lead, I think that's what's worked out well for me. And I would say that having gone forward from that, I have sought to pay that forward as well and sponsor as many other leaders and qualify people to try and to step out and to try and lead. I believe that you can tell a great leader by what their people are doing. So by nature, a leader's job is to recreate other leaders and to invite other people to become awesome, if you will.
I love that nugget that the job of a leader is to create the next leader. So do you see that really common these days? Do you see leaders creating other leaders?
I think when leadership is functioning at its best, you will, right? I think that leadership, as people have been studying it for years and years, that's not new. But what is new is that we have, certainly here in America, I know that there was 76 million baby boomers. And reportedly, as these 76 million baby boomers start to retire and die, you've only got 45 million Gen Xers. That's a big gap. but it's 31 million. Unfortunately, the baby boomers created an economy that kind of needs 76 million people to run it. So here in the States and certainly pockets of the world, you've got places that have a leadership gap and a labor shortage. That labor shortage is like, for example, it's hard to find good help these days. That's real. And there's a number of mitigating factors for that. But also with that is a corresponding leadership gap. And that's a challenge too. There's just simply not enough leaders to go around. There's not enough CEOs for all the CEO seats, if you will. So we've had to become more creative, delay sometimes the retirement age at some companies. In other cases, asking people to lead perhaps before they're ready or traditionally considered ready, if you will. So there's a lot of different aspects to that make it interesting, an interesting season to be kind of alive right now. The organizations that I'm interacting with, the point is whoever you've got in your organization, we need to make them better. And by helping them think and shift from working just hard to working hard and smart, and by making them more effective, coaching has been an effective way for companies to make more with who they have, to take whatever leadership capital that they currently have and put it in play, develop it, and improve it so that they can make more with less, if you will.
And did you find any challenges with working with companies in that direction of trying to equip more leaders?
Well, yeah, I think every company wants more leaders. The question is, are they willing to invest into it? Are they willing to pay for that? Are they willing to bring in an expert like a coach to be able to work with their people and to develop them? Are they willing to invest into leadership development materials like online learning platforms, or are they sponsoring things like MBA programs? Is there a culture of growth and learning in their organization? Is it a place where it's safe to make mistakes, right? So that you can learn from those. And what you're going to see in the coming years here is the companies that do a better job of bringing empathy, compassion, places that are bringing a healthy culture where we can be safe. We've got psychological safety so we can make mistakes, we can learn, we can grow. Those are the companies that are truly going to thrive in the next several decades.
True. I've seen that also. Creating the environment that is safe to make mistakes at least helps to enhance on someone's leadership, because there are organizations that will crucify you for even making a single mistake.
Right. Well, and if you're unsafe in that environment, what invariably happens is people do just enough to stay off the radar. They don't want to be noticed in that world. So the cost benefit is this. The benefit is that you have less mistakes. The cost is that your people aren't being creative. And if they're not being creative, that means that there are answers that lie within your human system that aren't being accessed. In other words, the company has acres of diamonds in their backyard that they're not accessing. They've got untold riches in their organization that they're not taking advantage of, and therefore they're not growing. And in my experience, the opportunity cost, once companies are aware of that, it becomes overwhelming, and let's make a shift so that we can access those answers. The answers, if they lie within the system, let's unlock those and get those going. Let's put those in play.
Wow. So based on your experience, did you discover any form of myths in that leadership, that you mean any myths about leadership in your career?
It's interesting. Sometimes there are stereotypes that people would assume that's what leadership looks like. And in my experience, I've seen all different types can lead well. So for example, Steve Jobs would be an example of a CEO that is celebrated here, particularly in the US. Like they'll study him at colleges. If you, Samuel, were to read his autobiography, though, you might read that and go, I'm not sure that's what a leader looks like. I'm not sure that's what I'd want my son or daughter to develop into. For example, he was famous for having what they would call a reality distortion field that would kind of emanate out from him. He would say things like, I need 1,000 songs in this box. And his engineers would say it's impossible. He'd say, yeah, have it by the end of the week. Now, on one side, we celebrate that's ingenuity, that is trying, it's breaking the bounds of what we understand as our limitations, and let's try. And that I would hold up as a good sign of leadership. However, an inability to listen to your people, to really connect with them emotionally, I would say is a problem. And I don't think a Steve Jobs would survive today based on the scrutiny that he would be under in 2024 compared to what he was dealing with in the 80s. You know, even those closest to him said that he was very hard to be around. So I would say, can't argue necessarily his genius, but I would significantly indict his emotional intelligence. And I would say that today, it just simply wouldn't be tolerated. Even in the 90s, he was kicked out of his own company. He was ousted from Apple in the 90s, if you recall. And a lot of us forget that because the story ended well. When he came back, he came up with the Mac again and eventually launched the iPod, which turned into the iPhone that almost all of us use now in the world. So he did create some amazing products, but I wouldn't say he would be the model of leadership. So that would be a great example of like the myth of leadership. So here would be another one. In the 80s, certain leadership styles were celebrated. Things like, is it better to be respected or loved? And in the 80s, it was, you want to be respected. Who cares about love? And I would say right now, if people don't like you, they won't stick around long enough to respect you. And in the 80s, perhaps the real perception was that you didn't really have a choice. You worked at one company in many cases, if at least not one career your entire life. That is out the window. In 2024, my generation, your generation, Samuel, will have 3 or 4 different careers. Never mind companies that we'll work for over a lifetime. And what that means is that perception of choice and the globalization of the economies. I could work, perhaps I could join you in Malaysia if things aren't working out here in Canada or the US. You know, because of that choice, it means that if I don't like the guy I'm working for, I'm not going to stick around. So it's not an either or zero-sum game anymore. Is it better be respected or liked? It's actually people better like you so they stick around long enough to respect you. Leadership is no longer simply a title. People need to see more. And I think they deserve more. So the best leaders today are the ones that are both respected and loved, celebrated, if you will.
Yeah, and I'm also wondering, does this also play into cultural appropriations in terms of different cultures? Some leadership styles thrive and some do not. And also in terms of the generations, the Gen Zs, the Gen Alphas, the Millennials and Gen Xs all require different levels or styles of leadership.
Certainly.
Do you think that also contributes?
I think it does. And I think that, because we have more voices speaking into even here American culture, that's a good thing, right? So if the more that here, again, being a Canadian, living in the US for 20 years, I think I'm a better American, not a citizen yet, but I think I'm a better citizen of my country because I've got a wider experience or perspective than most of my American friends would suggest. Many of my friends here, we live 8-hour drive away from Canada. Most of them have never gone. Now, they've driven 16 hours to get to Florida from here, but they've never been to Canada. Canada's scary for a lot of people. So that type of an ethic, I would say, it needs to pass. That needs to go away. The idea of just staying in my lane and just knowing my town that I live in, that needs to change, right? And I think even with the proliferation of the internet and things like smartphones, it makes it easier to see the best leader in Malaysia. It makes it easier to find the best leader in Uganda. It makes it easier to find the WowFactor podcast than it was even 10 years ago. So that globalization is, I think, really good. You're going to see cross-pollination between different styles. That said, it's never been more important for, I would say, Western companies, let's say like here in the US, to figure out things like compassion. Compassion works in Uganda, it works in Canada, it works in Asia, it's going to work here in the States. Seeing your people, truly caring about them, making sure that they've got an outstanding product and a tremendous program to work within. Those 3 things, I think, are going to be more and more important going forward. In my opinion, those 3 things are universal. If we have care and compassion for our people, if we have a great program for them to work within, a healthy culture, if you will, and an excellent product to be able to sell that exceeds the consumer's expectation, that is a recipe for success across the globe, not just here in the States. And I don't think that's an American concept. I think that one belongs to Team Human, not just here in the States, even though the States for a long time has kind of had the market cornered on leadership development. That is shifting.
Wow. Quite a lot to take in. So how can I say this? As we've just talked about leadership and leaders, so what would be the key ingredients of a good leader?
Key ingredients of a good leader, for me, I'm looking for somebody that's paying attention. They've got high emotional intelligence. So they're not only able to identify what their emotional state is and perhaps their ability to self-regulate that. If they're in a great mood, they might pivot into a different activity today because they're going to get higher ROI when they are in a great mood. Or if they identify that they're not in a great space, sometimes they can pause and pivot into a different emotional state. Or, hey, if I can't change my mood, I still need to do some work. I'm going to choose to regulate differently. I'm going to pay attention to the fact that I don't feel well and actually decide to do good work despite that. So I'm describing emotional intelligence here as the mark of a good leader, somebody that is able to identify where they're at emotionally and be able to self-regulate well. There's a second side to emotional intelligence, which also indicates that I should be aware of how others are doing and increase my ability to influence and support or serve that group. So if I am a leader and I'm going into a team meeting, let's say, and I read the room and I see that the energy's below the line, maybe we're not feeling great, it hasn't been a good week or a good month for sales, to be able to go in and identify that should adjust my approach for that day. I better not do what was very common 20 years ago, suck it up, buttercup, check your negative feelings at the door, just be awesome right now. That type of leadership now is toned down and not helpful. A good leader would go into that scenario and identify what the people need and to be able to serve some of those needs or meet those needs. If we're not feeling good, is there something that we could do or affect to change how the group feels? Can we see them? Can we hear them? And does that alone perhaps move the group forward? And then we can address some of the business concerns that we had coming into today. What I'm driving at is how people feel informs how they perform. Good leader knows this and identifies this and works with this. This is not new. Emotional intelligence is not a new I would say this. Our understanding of it is relatively new, and our desire to utilize this in leadership is relatively new. I'm going to say the last 60, 70 years, it's become more in fashion, in vogue. That said, how people feel is not new. People, when they feel good, do better work. That's not new. But the fact that we're paying attention to that is the fact that companies now need that to be able to retain the best and brightest people. That's relatively new. So if we can get people and companies to level up with that, that is going to be a direction that is, I think, here to stay. I don't think you can unring the bell on that one. This is going to be a mark of a good leader going forward. Am I able to identify how I'm doing? And can I affect others based on I'm paying attention to their emotional state and I'm looking to meet them where they're at? There's a lot of other things we could talk about with emotional intelligence. And I would say the marks of a good leader, that could take up an entire day, probably even a week. But for me, that's got to be foundational, is that emotional intelligence piece.
Well, I love that. I love the emphasis on focusing on how your team is doing, or how the team is, and also how are you feeling, because all those two govern how you're going to best lead them. And I also see that when that is well governed well, that also increases the level of team retention and reduces the amount of people who would have resigned from the job in case that you are a leader who has got low emotional intelligence.
Well, it increases retention. You just hit that, right? So less people quit because they feel like they're green and growing and they feel seen and they feel celebrated. And that type of a healthy culture, people will stick around. Even if there's another job offer that could pay a little bit more, they might stay here because they really enjoy the person they're becoming as a result of being in this company. So a lot of times companies, when they talk about retention, their goal is to just get people to not quit. So let's roll out free snacks in the cafeteria. Let's put a foosball table out or let them roller skate, in the office. Those are neat, but that won't retain somebody if they can make 20% over there. If somebody's green and growing, they're enjoying the person they're becoming. And this is a place where I can make mistakes, I can grow, I feel seen by my leader. I've got a clear track in terms of what advancement looks like, and I'm in clear communication with that. That is hard to leave. That is very attractive today. And that type of a culture retains people, not because they can't quit, not because we have a golden handcuff of shares that aren't mature yet, or right? What I'm driving at here is people stay because they feel good and they love the person that they're becoming. That person that they're becoming makes them more valuable in the job market. Now, hopefully this is a place where they can make more money here, because ultimately that does become important. If I'm blocked or I've hit the top of my pay grade, eventually you will lose people, and that's appropriate as they outgrow your company. But if that company would grow with you, boy, what a great thing. Now you're retaining people because the culture is strong. That is duplicatable. That is replicatable. That you can double down on all day long.
Awesome. Perfect. So now we're going to do a shift more into Veritas Leadership Group. So could you tell us more about it and why did you found it?
Veritas Leadership Group actually started about 8 years ago. I was still working at Vector, and I'd seen all of these programs and coaching, specifically how it was working really well within the company I was working with. And I was curious. I thought, well, if it works here, could I do this as well outside of here? And actually, could I get better at Vector by doing it outside of my company at the time? And the answer was yes. What I was so grateful for was that at the company I was at, I got very good quickly because I got a lot of repetitions in. The hardest thing for a lot of coaches is to get those repetitions, practice. The general understanding right now is it takes about 10,000 hours to become an expert in something. Well, because there's no shortage of people who wanted to be poured into at the company, I was able to achieve 10,000 hours very quickly. I wasn't having to send invoices out. And it turns out people, if it's free, would love to get coached. So I got a lot of repetitions in really early. And that helped me achieve kind of that mastery status. The challenge being is, as an employee, I wasn't able to make as much or command as much from those efforts as I could as an independent contractor or as an entrepreneur. Usually, I think I heard numbers from 6 to 10x is the number that you could make outside of a company as opposed to being an employee. So I certainly enjoyed the shade of the tree of working at a company for 30 years, and they gave me tremendous flexibility to grow in that coaching expertise, including having some hours to be able to do that outside of the company. That said, I grew Veritas Leadership Group from zero to a pretty thriving business, where the only way for me to continue to grow it was to leave the day job, if you will, and to really support Veritas full time. Part of the vision for that, instead of calling it Trent Booth Executive Coaching, was to not name it after myself so that we could have others participate in that as well. And so once I left the day job, now the dream was to start coaching other coaches and to have a group of us that could go into a company and not just work with the executives or the C-suites, if you will. Coaching is traditionally very expensive. And because of that, most companies only bring coaches in to work with the chief executive officer or the CFO or the COO. That's the type of investment. What we're doing is coaching the entire organization. So we've had a bit of a niche here where we're working with independent financial advisors. So think of a solopreneur where they've got anywhere from 6 to 10 employees in their office. These are very busy advisors. So they're busy making sales, they're busy touring, they're busy out getting more conferences, etc. So unfortunately, in that scenario, a lot of times they're not developing their teams. What we can do when we go in is it's almost like they're outsourcing leadership development for their team. So when they come back from a conference, instead of being depleted, their team is actually thriving. They've moved the ball on their own without the leader there. The leader's then freed up. Instead of being a solopreneur, now they're a true business owner because they've got an integrator that's taking all their ideas and they're building it up. All their people are feeling happy and whole. And when they come back, they're just able to continue to do what they do best. In many cases, that's not necessarily one-on-one development of their people. They can outsource that with coaching. So as a Veritas Leadership Group, what we do is we go into a company and we're working with, yes, the CEO and probably her right-hand person. And yes, we get to coach all the other rank and file people because we have other coaches that are relatively new. And when I say new, that doesn't mean that they're not excellent. It's just that they don't have the experience yet to charge top dollar as a coach. So these coaches then can work with, let's say, an admin assistant and help them to grow while they also get their own skills. And eventually down the road, the goal is, of course, for them to be able to earn higher incomes. But right now, short term, they can work with a lower price point, which allows those companies to have coaching all throughout their organization. In those experiences, we've seen companies grow from $0 to $18 million in 5 years. That's not typical, but it's real. We got in early with that startup. There's another case where several advisors that we've worked with have grown by double their assets under management, which usually means double their revenue, which in many cases quadruples their actual profit. When that happens, despite the fact that coaching is expensive, it seems to bear the cost of those increased numbers. Therefore, those companies tend to pay more. So we've loved what we're creating. We have 5 affiliate coaches right now at Veritas Leadership Group. We've got 3 that we're promoting pretty well right now, 2 that are still in process. But Veritas Leadership Group has grown by 30% in our first official year. We kind of had our grand opening about 15 months ago. And this year we're on pace to be able to not quite double, but it'll be a nice increase, about 50% increase is what we're projecting for 2024.
Wow, that is exceptional. That's an exceptional story. So did you have any challenges that you faced when you started Veritas Leadership Group?
Well, fortunately with coaching, here's what's fascinating is that a lot of things shifted in 2020 with the global pandemic. So for example, meeting via Skype like you and I are, that was pretty new back in 2020, although it became the way to meet, the only way to actually meet. What's fascinating to me is that I can be in my studio here in New Jersey and connect with you in Malaysia and forget that we are forever apart. Like we're so far. I mean, 100 years ago, it would take us weeks or months to be able to connect, even if we were both going at the same time. Today, it would still take, I would think, a 15-hour flight or probably 2 flights to be able to connect you and me, right? So like, even today, it's really far. And yet we could click a button and be together and hang out immediately. So Veritas Leadership Group is primarily an online coaching program. And what's fascinating is that we tend to forget because the connection now is so robust and people are so used to connecting via video chat. This wouldn't have been possible for us to try and launch, I don't think, 10 years ago. Today, really good. And since the pandemic, I don't have to ask people if they've heard of things like Skype or Zoom or Google Teams. This is pretty standard now for people to be able to meet here. Microsoft Teams, my bad. But the idea is that there's so many different ways and different platforms, including FaceTime even, for us to be able to have video chat and have through this magical portal and the magic of the internet, be able to connect in real time and relatively cheap. So if you think about the startup cost now for a coach, it's not thousands of dollars. It might be several hundred, right? Buy a good computer, buy a good webcam, get a decent microphone and a good system to be able to work with, have a solid internet connection. But now they can even do it from their home. So that makes coaching one of the least prohibitive options in terms of side gigs or ability to kind of, if I wanted to get a side business, this is one of the cheapest, easiest ways in terms of what I need to do to actually become a coach. In terms of certification, it's usually a $5,000 price tag to get certified. It can be as much as $20,000, but when you consider what it would cost to buy a Starbucks or to launch many of those other places, still relatively inexpensive. I would say this too, coaching from a time perspective is relatively inexpensive. By the time if I was to buy a McDonald's franchise, that's $1 million or more. It's going to take hours and really it's a full-time gig. I can't do that while I'm working full-time. I can't launch a franchise like that. Coaching though, once I've got that certification, once I've got a client that wants to meet with me and pay me, I could do that once a week for an hour or for 2 hours. So it's not hard for somebody to kind of dip their toe into the coaching pool and to start to develop that. That's unique. And what a time to be alive, Samuel, for us to be able to enjoy that. And even if I'm struggling to find my niche client here in this particular geographical area, there's a lot of those people across America or around the world. It makes it just so much easier to access great people.
That's great. So that means the original model that you had before the pandemic would have been in-person kind of coachings.
Well, what's interesting is that even for me, because our company was all of America and Canada, that meant that I was doing most of those coaching sessions via the phone. So a phone call back in the day, very few one-on-one in-person eyeball-to-eyeball coaching sessions. I'm a fan of those. I do have a few clients that are local, and I meet with them in person. And what's interesting, though, is that those sessions, even sometimes when that person's normally in person, but then we do a Skype or a Zoom session, it's interesting how the dynamic shifts. We actually get more done in a shorter period of time. It is a little more transactional, I would say, via online versus in person. There's usually a little more chit chat. How you doing? How's the family? When we're in person versus Zoom. It doesn't have to be like that. But what I'm driving at here is when I started coaching online, online was a phone call, and then it shifted to being able to do it via Zoom or FaceTime or Skype, for example. I think some of my several is actually Skype, not even Zoom. Zoom became prolific here in the US, at least in 2020. But that shift alone has made it so people are less weird. When it gets to being on Zoom, they've usually got a setup. We've figured out that if you have a window behind you and heavy lighting, that you get a silhouette. That's not good. Most people figured out, hey, I should probably have earbuds or some type of microphone to work with. Again, because it's become more culturally not just acceptable, but celebrated, it's been easier to meet online. Here's what has shifted. Many times, even during our time here together, Samuel, I can tell you're vibing and you're tracking what I'm saying based on your facial expressions, based on your eyes, based on your nodding your head. And those are all indicators that I get via video chat that I didn't get over the phone. It was way harder to do coaching over the phone. I've got way more access to other things here, including beyond just the vocal and the voice inflections, etc. Things like all those other nonverbal cues, which might comprise as much as 70%. I've seen some studies, 78% even of communication is those nonverbal cues. We get those at least with Zoom or with Skype video chat.
Yeah, really, it's really been great having these video conferencing platforms proliferate over the time.
Well, even this, I know where I am right now. It's before 11 o'clock a.m. What time is it for you in Malaysia right now?
It's 10 p.m.
Let me look at that. That's wild. Okay, so like you get to consider the fact that, again, the video chat made it so that we are, I think it's probably also Thursday where you are. I don't know. I started losing track of the international dateline, et cetera, right?
It is still Wednesday. It's
still
Wednesday. Thursday in the next 1.5 hours.
For a couple more hours. So, yeah, I mean, I had an inquiry from Australia recently, and I was like, man, I could have an Australian client. That actually could be a thing today. The time isn't super friendly. I'm in the Eastern time zone here in the U.S.,
yes.
So it's not super friendly. It's actually easier in Malaysia even than it is just a couple more hours later. But it's possible. It's one of those things where if someone in Australia wanted to access American coaching, they could certainly do that today, which again, even 5 years ago, I don't know that would be a thing.
I don't think it would be really a thing back in the days. The time zone again, and the cost would be really expensive.
About how technology is causing us to be able to leap like that. Things that weren't possible even 5 years ago are prolific and easy today. Never mind the fact that I remember growing up, cell phones weren't a thing for me. I was born in the 70s. So like I got to see things like faxes become a thing. I got to see, rotary phones were the thing. And then if you could hit an actual, dial tone or actually have keypads and buttons, that was very different. Things like answering machines. There was a machine separate from your landline that would pick up calls in the 80s. You think about how things have changed for today. The fact that you and I, you think about long distance charges back in the day, right? In the 80s, long distance would make this prohibitive. This would have been a very expensive phone call already. Not only is this infinitely better than a phone call, you know what this costs us to get together today? Nothing.
Okay.
Again, even 20 years ago, that was not a thing. So fascinating how much technology is changing and how much easier it is. It's making the world smaller, and I really appreciate that.
True. Yes, I'm going to throw you off a little bit because now there's been so much of the generative AI going on. So what do you think is going to have an effect on the coaching business?
I think you're going to find more and more coaches available, for one. So the word's kind of getting out that coaching could help our people level up. Also, you're going to find people that go, wow, I really enjoyed coaching. I think I might be a great coach. And as more and more coaches become available, I think you'll see other companies accessing that as well. I think that great coaches will always command a great price. I think, and as word gets out there, companies will see, hey, I can't afford this person full time, but fractionally, I could bring on a chief leadership officer. You could bring in that executive coach or head coach, if you will. That's going to affect coaching going forward as well. As word kind of gets out that coaching we're not a consultant. So that's one of the other big changes too. A consultant comes in, they're the expert. And most companies, I would say today, are not a big fan of giving up control to that consultant. That can be very invasive. The analogy that I use is kind of like a consultant's almost like doing surgery, where you're doing the full cut, and oftentimes the healing that's required after the surgery isn't necessarily for what was repaired, for what was wrong initially. It's the incision designed to get access to what was hurting that takes the majority of the healing time. Now, things like arthroscopic surgery, where you've got 3 little incisions, have dramatically reduced the healing time because it's less invasive. Now, I would describe coaching as being similar to arthroscopic surgery. Coaching is much less invasive compared to consulting. Consultants might have great answers. Coaching purports that the answers lie within the system. So instead of being the expert, the coach is coming in assuming that your experts are already in your company. And if we ask the right questions, we'll access those answers. Well, you're going to trust somebody in your organization, hopefully much more than an outside consultant or coach. And if you already trust this person and those answers are good and those are what moves us forward, it's much more likely that the company will take action on those and then affect change. What I'm describing here is a less invasive way to systematize accelerated growth through leadership of our people that are already here. So in that case, it's not as expensive as a consultant. A lot of the times, once the consultant leaves, a lot of the things that was great about that consultant leaves with them. That's not a good answer either. What I'm describing with coaching is all the progress that's made with those leaders is owned by those leaders, because the answers didn't come from the coach. The coach is asking good questions that empowers the leader to make new moves. Those new moves are not only more satisfying for that leader, but that now is replicatable down the road. That leader has grown as a result of that. The reason why I still work with companies 5 years later, it's not because they don't need me anymore. It's the wrong question. They're asking different questions to be able to scale with these new challenges that they have. We have more sophisticated questions that we ask to answer more sophisticated challenges. So they still work with me in many cases, not because they need me to build up or to keep them strong, almost like a steroid is required to stay big and strong once you're using that. This would be a much healthier approach to being able to build muscle and build strength. The strength that's built is not the coach itself. The coach is just a catalyst to build strength for those individual leaders. Those individual leaders, though, when they're stronger, certainly can carry on that new trajectory going forward. I think the future of coaching, it's going to be a burgeoning industry. I think you're going to probably see it start to get regulated in the States, because right now, anybody can hang a shingle and call themselves a coach. That will probably change. Kind of like once upon a time, anybody could call themselves a doctor. That's not the case anymore. Now doctors have to go through a particular amount of schooling. They've got to be certified. They've got to be insured. I think you'll start to see more and more of that in coaching down the line, which I think will be good for the industry. It'll force coaches to be better.
Awesome. So I'm now going to take a little bit a step back and look into the past. So what would be the best advice for your 19-year-old self?
19-year-old self. What a great question, Samuel. If I could go back to 19-year-old self, I would say take more notes, journal more. I started journaling when I was 19. I discovered what it was. And I think my take on it before, and for many people, when I speak about journaling, they're like, well, is that like Dear Diary? And that's a turnoff, especially for a lot of the males that I might be talking to. Like, well, if it's Dear Diary, that sounds like a female ethic, and I'm not sure I want to do that. I think journaling is so much more. First of all, I think that's tremendous to be able to get in touch. It's never been more in fashion, in vogue, to access both masculine and feminine power for men and women. You know, neither gender has the market cornered on journaling. And getting in touch with my emotional state, never been more in vogue, again, for both men and women as well. That said, I wish that I took more notes. I wish that I'd written more in my journal. I wish that I'd written not just on the bad days, because I would say if you were to look through my 19-year-old journals or 21-year-old journals, a lot of times I'm only writing in there when I'm really up against it, when I'm really working through a challenge or having a hard day, and I'm using the journal to kind of get through it. Sometimes I'm jotting down, hey, great weekend, let me just document some things. I wish I had done that more. I wish I had more discipline when it came to writing in the journal, because today, 50-year-old me would love to go back and see what my mind was. Not just me, I've got daughters now, and that are coming into that, son that is coming into that age, and to be able to show them some of my work would be nice too. There's a legacy aspect that I would say I was discounting as a 19-year-old, because we don't see ourselves when we're 19 as being 50 and having children, perhaps. I wish I'd written more. I'll put it that way. I wish I knew that the things I was doing then really would matter today. I wrote some workshops back then. So when I was journaling, when I was capturing thoughts and ideas and philosophies, I wrote things that still hold up today. 19-year-old Trent had some really cool ideas that were based on leadership. I was reading some things that I could take one of those workshops right now. One of them was called How to Be a Class Act in Business. And the cultural impact of that workshop is relevant today. It would hold up. It's still good, in other words. I'm like, just because it was 19 doesn't mean it wasn't awesome. I felt it was pretty awesome at the time. I just didn't know how generically excellent it would be over time. In other words, truth is truth. So things that were true back then are still good today as well. I wish I knew that. I wish that that would probably have changed the urgency with which I would have continued to read and ingest more knowledge, ingest more leadership principles, knowing that, hey man, the more you read, the more you grow, the more you learn, the more you attract, the more business that you can develop, the more people you can speak into, the bigger ideas swimming around your brain, and all of that really matters. So, by the way, I know I don't have a time machine and I can't go back and tell that to Trent Booth. However, with podcasts, if you've got a 19-year-old here listening, listen, 19-year-old, I'm talking to you like I wish I could talk to 19-year-old Trent Booth. Read more books, take more notes, and celebrate that the things that you're doing are great and might set a foundation that, yes, 50-year-old you will look back on and go, wow, I'm glad I invested that time.
I can't even add anything to that. Really epic.
I love your question. I saw, actually, it was Bono from U2. He was in a Rolling Stone interview, and they asked him a similar question. And it's just fascinating to see rock stars, what they would say to themselves. They would say, hey, don't take yourself too seriously, I think was the gist of what he would say to a younger Bono, who was pretty serious and felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. And I think, that doesn't describe most 19-year-olds, but some. And I don't think I was typical as a 19-year-old. I had some of those challenges on my mind as well. But it's a great question, because I think one of the things we have lost in today is this generation doesn't necessarily look to their elders. They might look online. So something that's really popular on TikTok right now might be a voice in somebody's life, but they maybe have not earned it. They've got a lot of followers, they got a lot of likes, but they perhaps haven't earned their wisdom at this point. I'm not saying they don't have anything for you to be able to learn. I would say, though, that I would encourage that younger generation to look to that older generation to learn and glean. I might encourage some of those that are baby boomers and Gen Xers to be patient with the millennials and with the Gen Y group, right? To invest into them and bring some of your wisdom to bear and not get frustrated with how they show up. The big joke right now is, Gen X and baby boomers might call millennials snowflakes because they're all special, you all have feelings. I'm like, whoa, hold on. First of all, Gen X, these are your kids, or baby boomers, these are your grandkids. You created these. You're somewhat responsible for how these guys showed up. So if you don't like how they're showing up, you got nobody to blame but yourself. Number one. Number two is there's something, if we're humble, that we can learn as Gen X from those millennials, and we better start. But on the other side, I'm hoping that millennials also see that there's an opportunity to learn something from those that have gone before as well. It's not like we're devoid of knowledge just because we don't, we're not used to working at home and we put a tie on sometimes. Right? There's something that all the generations can learn from one another. So my note specifically to baby boomers, don't dismiss those that are younger than you just because they're younger than you. They've probably got something. And even more, don't disqualify yourself from having a voice from that group because you're looking down your nose and judging them. Take the time to earn a platform with them. And I know you didn't have to learn the platform before because you had the title. That's not how the world works anymore. You've got to earn trust with that group. Trust isn't implied with your title. Take the time to get to know them. Get curious instead of critical. That is respected and celebrated in those younger generations. Get to know them, get curious, and see if that isn't reciprocated. They'll get curious with you too.
What I've actually noticed from your conversation is that there's a lot involved in understanding what the other generations are going through. And more, again, the emotional intelligence comes back in again, that you put yourself in their shoes. So how are they dealing with things? Like for the generations after the millennials were born with the internet, so they are more prone to things which of course the boomers were much stronger because of the situations they were born into, followed by the Gen Xers. But the ones that followed after, of course, you call them snowflakes because of the experience they've gone through. But it's good to also understand it from how have they gone through those situations, and then give them the guidance where required.
Yeah, it's not new again. Nothing's new under the sun, Samuel. But baby boomers were judged by the greatest generation. Okay, so the greatest generation had World War II, right? The Korean War, Vietnamese War, etc., right? The boomers, right? So here's what's funny. Like, for example, my mom didn't make me continue piano lessons because her mom did, right? So her mom made her, like the greatest generation, made the baby boomers follow through and do it, even if they didn't want to. But then I think a lot of the boomers swung the pendulum the other way and didn't make me do the things I didn't want to do. Samuel, I quit piano because I wanted to play baseball outside. Now, I like that I got to play baseball. That was a great childhood, but I really regret not learning piano. I eventually learned how to play guitar and sing, but what I wouldn't give to be able to sit down on a piano that I have upstairs and be able to play it if I just stuck with those lessons. Because 5-year-old Trent doesn't have the mental capacity to understand that discipline is required to get good at that thing. And you'll want to later. You'll be glad you did. So again, I'm just describing here and taking a long way to describe why the generation judges the next generation. You know what I'm saying? Now, again, Gen X, we ran around. We didn't have a real time to be in. And my friends' parents could, have hard words with me, and they were parenting me as well. And we just kind of ran around and drank from the garden hose and didn't wear a helmet when we rode a bike. And it was a different time to be alive. I'm sure I had concussions playing soccer as a kid and taking a cold soccer ball off a head, But concussions weren't a thing, so you're a little fuzzy, but you kept playing through it. Today, things have changed. And it's not their fault, is what I'll say. A kid, for example, growing up right now that has never known a world where they haven't been able to just get any song they want at any given time. And to be able to hum basically a song and have an app with AI figure out what song that is crazy. I remember a time, Samuel, and this might outdate you, where I'd hear a song on the top 40 and go, what song is that? And I would have to wait until the next day, or maybe until it accidentally came around for me to get it. And if I wanted to have a version of that, I'd either have to buy a whole record or tape, or again, the technology showed up where I could record it. I could record the radio. Oh man, the cassette, and create things like a mixtape. Gen X celebrates that we had mixtapes. Well, this generation has other benefits to itself too, right? So different. To get back to your point, though, you're describing empathy, right? For me to be able to put myself in their shoes, that's empathy. for me to get curious instead of critical, that gives me a chance of staying empathetic. That gives me a chance of seeing the world through their perspective, through their eyes, if you will, to walk a mile in their shoes. If I can stay curious, not critical, all of those generations will benefit from that core value. If they say, hey, as a leader, I identify as being curious first and foremost, that will lead to empathy. That will lead to greater leadership ability.
Awesome. So how would you like to be remembered?
I'd like to be remembered as being altruistic, and that's a relatively new word to me. I heard that term, I think, like altruistic, and as being somebody that is really, my definition is radically sold out to somebody else's success. Altruistic, radically sold out to somebody else's success. I'd like to be remembered as somebody that added value, as being a net giver, somebody that gave more than he took, somebody that asked great questions. And I know how that feels when somebody asks me great questions and is curious and pours into me. I'd like to be known as somebody that poured into others and worked towards transformation. Even more than them being excited for a moment or inspired, I would love to think that some people heard some of those ideas, decided to make a change, and they're better as a result of that. Wow, what a tribute that would be. That would feel pretty good.
Wow, you want to be fully invested in someone else's success. I like that.
Wildly sold out to somebody else's success.
Wow.
I mean, just laying out to be able to make sure somebody else does well. Not just my kids. I'm saying anybody I'm coaching, anybody that I'm certifying to become a coach. We want to be wildly sold out to their success. Whatever it takes, we're going to stay curious. We're going to help you move forward and get unstuck. That feels like something I hope I can do, and I'd never retire from, Samuel. I hope I never retire from that. As long as my brain's working, I'd love to be coaching well into my 70s, 80s, Lord willing. We'll see what happens.
Amen to that. So it has been an amazing conversation with you, Trent. So many nuggets of wisdom, but my head is just like fully loaded.
It's fun. We call that drinking from the fire hose of awesome. It's one of my favorites. Just sit down for a little bit and go, oh, that's great. Oh, that's great too. You honor me. Thank you. I appreciate that.
So thank you so much for being a guest on the WowFactor podcast. So would like to hear your final remarks as you sign out, and where can people find you?
People can find us at veritasleadershipgroup.org. Veritasleadershipgroup.org has a way to connect with us on all social media platforms, from Instagram to LinkedIn and all points in between, YouTube, etc. So if somebody wanted to go deeper and hear a little bit more about this, we have plenty of online resources there, including videos and other programs available. If somebody wanted to book a Zoom session with me and connect one-on-one and see if coaching is right for them or for their company, there's a place to be able to book a consultation there as well. Parting thoughts would be this. I said it earlier, and I'll share it again. Get curious more than critical. Curious instead of critical gives us a shot of getting empathetic, putting ourselves in their shoes, and frankly, earning a platform for people to like us, perhaps even get to trust us, so that we can continue to serve them and lead them well. Leadership is everything. And here's what I love. When you work on that, it'll affect all aspects of life. It'll affect you at home, as a parent. It'll affect you as a son or daughter. It'll affect you as a leader at the workplace. It'll affect you in your communities where you volunteer and perhaps serve. Leadership is the killer app, and love within that, I would say, is even better.
That's really awesome. Thank you so much, Trent. It's really an honor having you on the podcast. The conversation, it can go on forever, but all good things have to come to an end. And thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Samuel. Appreciate it.
Pleasure.